Well, it's really exciting to be able to be here and to be able to talk with you, Parker, with this audience of religious educators. As we all know, you have been such a wise and giving person, and I think that we all feel so fortunate to be able to have followed you with your journey through the years as you reflected on the intersections of spirituality and professional life and social change. And like me, my first book, the first book that I read was The Courage to Teach, and that came out just before I completed my doctoral work, and I think it really opened up possibilities for me, just as I think it has for many people. I came to teaching when I think it was transitioning from the sage on the stage model to something that was more interactive, and so your book gave me an opportunity to think about how to be engaged with the people that are learning as fellow travelers on the journey. And I wanted to begin by then asking you some questions about your views on teaching and some of the things that you contributed for us. So to start, I guess, with a hidden wholeness. Your approach to teaching in a hidden wholeness is very much about working with the soul, and you liken the soul to a wild animal that's deep in the woods of our psyche, and that it can be scared easily, and that we need to approach it gently, and that we need to wait for it and create inviting spaces for it. And so I'm wondering, can you talk with us about why it's important for you to think about, why teachers need to think about their souls in the enterprise of teaching? Tell us a little bit about why it's important for teachers to think about their souls in the process of, as they're thinking about education. Why is it that we need to start with thinking about ourselves?
Well, let me say a couple words about this notion of the soul, first of all. I think if education wants to stay on the surface of things, then forget about the soul. The soul doesn't care about the surface of stuff. The soul is about the depths of life. And of course, sadly, there's a lot of education that either wants to stay on the surface with simply facts and theories and information and stuff. And then there's other forms of education that are under great pressure to stay on the surface because dominated by high-stakes testing and only interested in things that are immediately measurable, short-term measurable. Teachers who would like to go deeper with their students don't have a chance to go deeper with their students. So it's a huge and complicated problem. But one of my deepest convictions is that there is in every person, what Quakers call it, that of God in every person, but there is in every person a deep voice of truth, of identity and integrity, of selfhood, that wants to speak and that has questions of meaning and purpose. And I do not believe that these are simply midlife questions, as I sometimes hear. I think they're questions that children are asking from a very young age, and certainly teenagers and college students or young adults are asking them. But they grow up in institutions which discourage them from asking those questions, and so they're conditioned not to bring them forth, right? We don't bring those questions forth, those deep questions of meaning and purpose and identity and integrity, if we don't feel that the space is safe. It's very simple. If we feel that we're going to get mocked or dismissed or marginalized or abused or invaded, or more commonly, simply unheard, unrecognized, which is as painful or can be as painful as some of the others, then those questions are not going to come forward. So, there's a whole lot of assumptions behind my interest in soul, and one is that we want to go there, we want to take our students there, and that we who teach and who administer and lead institutions have the courage to carve out safe spaces in an unsafe world where there's a lot of pressure against our doing that. We have the courage, we have the savvy. I've been doing some writing in recent years on what would it look like if we trained every professional not only to do the core, to have the core skills and knowledges of his or her profession, but also to have some of the instincts and skills of a community organizer. who knows how to create safe spaces in the midst of unsafe situations. If we want to take our students there, we have to go there ourselves. I've come a long way around the barn to answer your question. There are certain places in life that you cannot take others if you haven't been there yourself. And I think, generally speaking, the field of religion, once you get beyond dates, place names, rubrics, and doctrine, and abstract theological concepts, once you get into the arena of the spiritual journey, the encounter with God or the holy or the great mystery, unless you've been traversing that territory yourself, there's no way you can guide students into or around it. And so coming to know the territory of the soul in ourselves is a critical ingredient for those of us who wish to take our students there and who can find ways to protect those institutional spaces where that might happen. And I'll simply add just a quick personal word. I've done this in my writing, but I always feel that this is important. At least it has an integrity for me, and it reminds me about my own journey, which I find that therapeutic. I don't think I knew much about the soul until I struggled through my first experience of profound clinical depression. And what I discovered in that experience, to put it very quickly, is that all of the faculties that I had carefully trained and learned to depend upon were useless. So there was my mind, there was my ego, there was my emotional life, and there was my willpower, right? That's a pretty good catalog of the stuff we normally depend on. And in my case, a couple of those had been, pretty highly honed. So in depression, the intellect is worthless. This is not a problem you can think your way out of. You may have thought your way out of 1,000 problems before, but not this one. The ego, which has its virtues, we all need ego strength, the sense of self, is shattered in depression. Depression is a sense of self-annihilation. The emotions are dead and gone. Those who know something about depression know that it's not a feeling of being sad. The terror of depression is that you can't feel anything at all. And so that's a useless faculty. And the willpower, which we often use to just keep putting one foot in front of the other, turns out to, operate at a very low level. I kept a little journal of personal achievements during my experience with depression. And those achievements were things like, was able to get out of bed at 10 o'clock this morning rather than 10:30. And if I had a couple of those during the day, that would be progress. That was not my normal metric for achievement, right? But what I became aware of as I watched all of those other faculties being rendered useless, what I became aware of was that way back in the woods somewhere there was occasionally a sense of a little spark of animal vitality, a little original wildness that I came to associate with the soul. Spark of Hasidic Jews call it the spark of the divine in every being. I came to think of it as that of God in every person. And occasionally becoming aware of it, I started to liken it to a wild animal in the woods. That on the one hand is very resilient, very tough, knows how to survive where other parts of us don't know how to survive. Can get along with very little food, can winter through where other parts of us can't. And so I became aware that it was keeping me alive. That it was the one thing I could turn to in those moments when I was asking myself the question, is this the day to end it all? And on the other hand, that thing didn't put in frequent headline spotlight appearances, just like wild animals. It was very shy. It needed me to be very quiet and very receptive and very open and very respectful for it to feel safe enough to show up. I got to thinking about wild animals. If you want to see a wild animal, the last thing you want to do is run crashing through the woods, yelling for it to come out. But you want to go into the woods and sit at the base of a tree and breathe quietly with the earth for a while. And maybe it will put in an appearance. And if it does, you won't, you'll never forget it. And you won't need to manipulate it or ask it to get into better light so you can take a picture or do anything except be there long enough for you to experience the wonder of it. And I got to thinking about that sort of quiet receptivity and what it would take to create the safe space to bring out that deep yearning in all of us for the voice of the soul to speak. Now, I'm not saying that's the only mode of education that's worthwhile. And I'm not saying that that's the only way that it's valuable for human beings to gather with one another. And I'm not saying that information and theory and logical thought and critical thinking are not valuable. Of course they are. I rely on them when I'm in good health. I'm simply saying there's a lost dimension which helps explain why there are so many lost people in the world and why we're losing so much in education, in religious congregations, and in the society at large. And I do believe that recovering safe spaces for that is part of recovering all that we're losing in all those other settings.
Thank you. Yeah, it strikes me sometimes that it seems like we have almost a collective depression in higher education today, and in some facets of education, that we've seen so many cuts to education. You're in the state now where we're proudly 49th in the country in terms of higher education support. And so I think we're all feeling it, especially I think in the arts and humanities. Those of us who are committed to seeing education as sort of a part of what it means to be human, helping people to embrace themselves and embrace their role in society. And that's so counter to, I think, where a lot of the funds have gone, where a lot of the public conversation has gone about education. And I'm wondering if you can talk, I see a real connection between what you were talking about here at the individual level of the soul and your concern for needing some way to find the soul and be quiet, and a connection with what's happening in higher education, the sense that we have of needing some spaces to recollect and to try to rebuild, maybe toward the roots back to the roots of what higher education is about. And I see that in your recent work on higher education. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see the need for reform in higher education and how people can work toward that.
Well, I think education is partly about following what society says it needs, and partly about leading society to understand what it really needs. And let's face it, the first is a business deal. And we're pretty good at making business deals. And unfortunately, that's about all we're doing in higher education these days. The second is leadership and courage. And politics, in the best sense of the word, it's using the bully pulpit to say, here's a vision of possibility, that we can reach. Here's some historical reminders of how the good stuff we've got came from precisely such visionary leadership and educating people to follow it. I mean, there was a time in American higher education and in American public education when formation for citizenship was the core vision of why we have these schools. I'm writing a new book on democracy and education and religion and a lot of other stuff. I've been reading Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, which is, was written by this 26-year-old genius who visited this country for 6 months from France in the 1830s and went home knowing more about the place than most of us who've lived here all our lives know today. It's a really remarkable book. Well, in 1835, there's already elementary education in this country. And Alexis de Tocqueville is seeing that one of democracy's chances is that these schools are out there forming citizen habits of the heart. So then something happens around the turn of the century where we start building high schools to look like factories, which they did and do, in order to acclimate kids to the working conditions that they were being prepared to fit into. And so instead of educating people for leadership in a society of a visionary sort rooted in the deepest values of democracy and all of the great spiritual traditions, among which I include secular humanism, because there's a root system that feeds all of these systems of meaning that has to do with identity and integrity, with selfhood. Instead of educating kids to create a society, we educate them to fit into slots that the society offers. So we're still in that battle. Now look, here's one of the concepts that I work with a lot when I work with questions of social change, which is really the kind of question you're asking. And is there a link between the soul and social change? You bet your boots. That's a technical term, I don't want to use it. You bet your boots. Look at one of the major episodes of social change in 20th century America, the civil rights movement, the Black liberation movement, which began not in the 1950s, but began the day the first slave ship hit these shores, as Vincent Harding, a great historian, Black historian, shows in his book, There is a River. You look at that long-term movement, which changed the lay and the law of our land, and it's inescapably true that soul is intricately intertwined with all the social movement energies that resulted in practical political achievement in the 60s. And it was actually the abandonment of soul and that has led to certain losses or a certain amount of stagnation and the need really in some ways to reinvigorate that movement on behalf not just of African Americans but all kinds of marginalized people. So the history of every movement for social change is, I believe, deeply rooted in soulful questions. I argue that historically you can make a very good case that every movement has its Rosa Parks, not just a great person, but a person who's emblematic of thousands and millions of others who are in this same energy field at the same time, who are making the decision that I call the decision to live divided no more, which is the decision to no longer behave on the outside in a way that contradicts a truth one holds deeply on the inside. That's the story of gay and lesbian liberation and movement toward rights, is to say, I know I'm a full human being, a child of God on the inside, and I am no longer going to behave on the outside as if this homophobic or sexist or racist society could be the boss of me. Just not going to let it happen. And one by one, as those decisions get made and those energies constellate, social change starts to happen. Now it's not magical. It requires discipline, it requires leadership, it requires strategic thinking, but it requires a lot of soul. And we don't ever want to give up, in the arena of religious education, the notion that we're tapping into something that isn't, if it's soul, if it's God, if it's the divine, if it's the Holy Mystery, we're tapping into something that isn't just an artifact of la-la land. We're tapping into something that is of historical, demonstrable power to make things happen in real life. As far as I'm concerned, it's the only way real things have ever happened among real people in real space and time, is going to that place of identity and integrity, constellating those energies, disciplining them. Let me tell you just a quick story. Robert Coles, the great psychiatrist from Harvard, was in Oxford, Ohio, when a group of young people, a couple hundred young people, gathered there to prepare to go down to Mississippi for what became the infamous Mississippi Summer, the killing fields of Mississippi. And they spent days with social science leaders and community organizers and tacticians and strategists, reading about the theory and practice of nonviolent social change. Well, 3 young men from that group got eager to get on with the work, and they went down there ahead of the rest of the group, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodwin. And they, of course, were the 3 who were murdered very shortly after they arrived there by the Klan. And word came back to Oxford, Ohio. A couple hundred young people and their advisors gathered, who were then faced with a crushing, heart-wrenching dilemma. Do we give up the ghost and go home because more of us may die? Or do we continue with our commitment to witness to human integrity in this racist setting and go on down there as planned? Well, they continued and they went on down, but they spent the next 2 days throwing the social science and the strategizing out the window. And Robert Coles wrote an article about it in a journal called Daedalus, titled The Words and Music of Social Change. Out go the social science textbooks, out go the community organizing theories, and what comes in instead is readings from the Psalms, readings from the Quran, readings from the Hebrew Bible, readings from the Christian scriptures, the poetry of the Greeks, Shakespeare, music, classic, blues, and contemporary. And that's what fueled the young people's witness in Mississippi that summer, in spite of and in the wake of their enormous grief and the fear it engendered over the deaths of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodwin. It wasn't the social science, it was the soulful words and music of social change. And you cannot point to a movement for social change in the world that hasn't had both the strategic dimension and the soulful dimension to it. So just one more word on that. It's tough stuff. And we're not going to see results in my lifetime or yours. But that's not the point. As a friend of mine at the Catholic Workers once said when I asked, how do you do this? day in and day out, and the tide of misery just keeps washing back over. Cassie Temple looked at me and said, Parker, don't you understand that just because something is impossible doesn't mean it's not worth doing? I may have got too many double negatives in there. She said it right, whatever it is. And left it in right now. So we stand in what I call a tragic gap. And the gap is tragic, not simply because it's sad, it's because in the Greek sense, it's built into the nature of things. It's inevitable. And the gap is between the hard realities around us and what we know to be possible. Not a wish dream, not a fantasy, but what we know to be possible. So the hard reality is that a lot of schools are under either economic or high-stakes testing pressures to stay on the surface and not go deep. But we know a different kind of education is possible because we've seen it. A lot of churches are caught up in the let's get more members model rather than the let's witness as remnant to the most profound possibilities of the God-human encounter, the divine-human encounter. We're caught in this tragic gap. We've seen this thing happen, but we know what's over here. And that walking in the tragic gap requires us to cultivate the discipline of not flipping out on either side. So you flip out onto the side of too much reality, and what you get is corrosive cynicism. Okay, I see how this works, and I want a career here, so I'll cut my deal with it and do what I'll just get along. I'll do what I can to get along. Over here on the side of too much possibility, you get irrelevant idealism. You get people flying above the battlefield, observing and saying, wouldn't it be nice if? So corrosive cynicism, irrelevant idealism, they sound like exact opposites, but they both have the same outcome. They take you out of the action. So what we need are lots of people who are fortified at the level of soul, who can keep walking and moving in that tragic gap, witnessing to the next best possibility and the next best possibility, bringing a few more people and a few more and a few more with them. As Margaret Piercy says in one of her poems, you know who you mean when you say we, and each day you mean one more. So these are the sensibilities of social change. It's not about master reform plans for institutions. It's about a remnant people within those settings taking one more, and one more. And understanding that their success is not to be measured by numbers, but by what the world calls effectiveness, but by faithfulness. Am I being faithful to my call? Am I being faithful to my best flights and leading? I mean, again, I'll get personal. I'm not the only person in this room who's of an age when you start really believing that you're mortal. You entertain this as an interesting idea. But now the wheels start falling off, you really understand that you're mortal. And you start thinking about last things. And among those is, what questions do I want to be able to answer on the day I draw my last breath? And I really, really don't believe that the questions I'm going to care about are, did you write enough books? Did they sell enough copies? Did you get enough positive reviews? Or even really, what did your friends and colleagues think of you? I think the question I'm going to be asking is, did I live it by my best life? did I do the best I knew how to, in the midst of my brokenness, my limitations, to take a next step towards something good? And did I forgive myself when I fell down trying to do that, or backed away for a moment from the challenge, so that I could get up and do it again? I think those are the kind of questions we'll be asking. I think St. Benedict was right in his rule when he said, daily keep your death before your mind. Not a morbid counsel, but a life-giving counsel to remind you to spend this day, this moment as well as you can.
You know, what I came to yesterday's sessions as well here at the Religious Education Association, and one of the things that I was struck with in this group is that a number of the religious organizations that the people here are part of are struggling. Are trying to find what the purpose is right now for religious education. I think your words have been so inspiring for us. And I've heard a tension between over authority, basically. You know, that we know, you know, even as you were talking about the civil rights movement, that we know there's this strong tradition from our religious faith to draw on in times of difficulty and in times of struggle. And I think there's a sense among those of us who've been around for a little while that younger generations don't know those traditions and don't know how to draw on those in this time when they feel as if things are very secular or that things are so plural they don't know how to talk about their own tradition. So I hear there's this sort of kind of an identity crisis, I think, in some ways among religious educators about what is their role? Is it to be trying to help people to know the tradition and know the text and know how to make those kinds of connections? Or is it to live this out? And I'm putting that in an either-or setting because I think I've heard that actually in the way people frame it. And maybe there's another way to frame that as well. I'm just wondering if you could reflect with us a little bit about what you see as some of the goals or the real need for religious education right now.
Well, I mean, it's a great question. All of your questions are great. I'm one of those who wish we could have a whole session on your let's not forget that piece. You're obviously working with some of these questions. So what I believe is, and I'm sure it's a belief shared by many here, I think the first task of the educator is not to talk, but to listen. And young people these days, these young people that we think are lost or that we are losing, I just think that's because they're not like us. And that makes us feel bad. So we should get over it. We should get a life. And then when you get a life, you can say, well, what are you seeing? You young people, you know, what are you seeing? What are you saying to yourselves and to each other about what you see? Help me understand this world whose horizon you can see more clearly now. I mean, I don't feel over the hill, but if I think about it along the curvature of the earth, I'm enough over the hill that I can't see the horizon they're standing on, right? I can see a horizon, but it's not necessarily the one they're seeing. So what are you seeing on that far horizon? And then let's talk. And then maybe, when I hear you confused or perplexed, maybe I can suggest a lens or two through which what you're seeing might become a little more understandable or coherent. I mean, I went through in my own Christian formation, I went through a period where it was all about, and this is just kind of a Zen formulation, you know. First, you know, it's a three-step deal where before you get enlightened, a mountain is just a mountain, and then, you know, once you get enlightened, or as you're getting enlightened, the mountain is no longer a mountain. And after you get enlightened, the mountain is a mountain again. You know, it's like, so I went through this thing in my own Christian formation, where first there was grace, there was redemption, there was forgiveness, there was salvation, you know, there was the presence of the Holy Spirit, there was incarnation, there was death and resurrection as abstract, received, notions that came from my home church or from theological seminary. And then I went through a whole bunch of life crises where all that stuff fell apart. It just didn't work for me. It wasn't the least bit helpful. And then I found myself reclaiming those lenses as ways of looking at the tough stuff that had happened and helping me make sense of it. That makes sense, that sort of three-step cycle. So you reclaim what Quakers would call an experiential, or in the old language, an experimental faith. You know, Sidney Carter, who wrote Lord of the Dance, has this great couplet. Your holy hearsay is not evidence. Give me the good news in the present tense. Like that a lot. So, you know, you can have a dialogue with young people about the good news in the present tense, but you need to know what the present tense is first, and that's the language they're speaking. Well, we just did a democracy conference in Boston around this, because I'm trying to go public more with this new book before it's finished, so I can learn something. So often you write a book and then you learn later what you needed to know because of the reactions to it. So I'm trying to learn before I publish it. It took me 70 years to get there. So we really worked hard to get young people to this conference because we knew they saw democracy differently. So we had this one young woman named Courtney Martin. She's about 30. And she's written a book called Do It Anyway. And her whole thing is that too many people in her generation set out to be activists in order to save the world. And that lasts for about 18 months. And then they go on to become stockbrokers. Because the whole thing falls apart. You can't save the world. So she has profiled in this book, Do It Anyway, 7 or 8 young activists who understand that they stand in the tragic gap, who understand that this gap is never going to close, but who understand that just because something is impossible doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And here's a young person rallying people of her generation, teaching people of my generation. And we had a fabulous conversation, which became closer and closer in our understanding of them. But it all started with, it started with her sending me an email and saying, what can you tell me about this? Because I've read stuff of yours that seems supportive of it. And I said, no, what can you tell me about this? Because you know a lot I don't know. So let me listen for a long time while you talk. And I think we need to do that. I also think this. I also think, just to put it in the crudest terms, that there's an enormous market for listening. It sells like hotcakes. And it amazes me that more people aren't out there doing it. It's one of the deepest desires and needs of the human heart to be listened to be recognized, to be acknowledged, to be heard. Many of you know the work of Nell Morton, and she has this great phrase, that the task in our time is to hear people into speech. It's a brilliant phrase. And I think of what churches and other congregations can do by becoming listening hosts in various thoughtful, disciplined, systematic ways for all of these folks who want to be listened to, and the people who would flock to them in those regards. Some of the greatest social change work going on in our time is about listening. I'll give you a couple of examples. Inner city churches, which are using the safe space provided by those congregations to help police officers and local citizens listen to each other and heal relationships and create community policing dynamics that are collaborative rather than competitive or combative. Veteran-civilian dialogues where people in the anti-war movement are understanding what life is like from a veteran's viewpoint. And veterans are understanding how they may have more common cause than they thought with people in the anti-war movement who don't hate veterans, but who hate the way our society treats the folks it sends to war. And the class-biased and race-biased way in which armies get put together. There are listening projects going on all over, and churches are great places for listening if we can get a life, if we can let go of our sense that the deal here is to, is to build ourselves in the conventional terms that we measure, and instead build, in my tradition, in my language, build the body of Christ, which isn't about numbers, but it's about the quality of relationships and respect and generativity of those relationships.
I think the idea of listening is so key. And, I think for those of you who are not on Parker's Facebook page, he uses his Facebook page as sort of a listening post. And I noticed that just after the election, he posted a couple of questions about how do people talk about the common good and how do they talk about citizenship. And it was interesting to read the variety of responses. In my research, I've been talking with young people about that. And one of the things that I do as a person who's involved in media education is help young people to tell their own stories through using media. And so I'm wondering if that's something that, if that's something that you've seen as a possibility, because I see your work in a lot of ways as extending kind of the John Dewey tradition of education and of the role in society to see education and speaking, which we I call journalism, as a way of kind of understanding stories of difference and how people can then come to appreciate others through really listening to those stories and helping people to tell their own stories as well, so that they're able to kind of find a framework for talking about who they are in a way that that builds a public rather than builds divisiveness.
Well, one thing I know for sure in the midst of this divided society is that the more you know about another person's story, the less possible it is to dislike or distrust them, let alone to hate them. That really is true. I've seen it happen time and time again. I've seen experiments, and recently was with people, some of them were at our Boston Democracy Conference a couple weeks ago, where folks are brought together around a very contentious issue like abortion. And for a full day on retreat, they are forbidden from telling each other what their position on the issue is. But they are coached, and this always involves discipline. This isn't, okay, let's just talk. This is always about a structure, a pedagogy, a thoughtful approach to complex problems. So they're coached in how to tell a story, the story that brought them to wherever they are on this issue, without making it a sales pitch for their position, just to tell the story, which is a discipline art in itself. So they learn to do that. Stephen Lewis was with you last night. He's done a lot of work with Marshall Ganz's public narrative notion. So is the Episcopal Church, national narrative. And this is a similar kind of storytelling. So in the last hour or so of these difficult conversation workshops, people are then allowed to speak with each other in small groups and in moderated forums about their positions. But by this time, two people who hold exact opposite positions on the issue have learned that the story that brought them to that point is about 90% the same. Right? And so something happens in terms of how they are able to hold their difference. Something happens that's humanizing, that's ameliorating, that's bridge building. Doesn't mean anybody changes their mind, but that something more important happens. There's a change of heart. I really don't think changing people's minds is the issue. I think changing the heart is a lot more important. And I think we know how to do that. If you look at most of our discourse in this society about anything, it's about hurling our positions at one another rather than telling our stories. And we refine those positions and we hone them and sharpen them like blades so that we can use them as weapons in the combat of conversation, or conversation as combat. And of course, what we end up with is blood on the floor. Why wouldn't we? It's nonsense to think we end up anywhere else. So here's one of my big bafflements about my own Christian tradition. As far as I can tell, Christianity that Jesus talked about was personal and relational and not propositional. How did it become all propositions and no people in relationships? Or how did the balance shift so bad? As far as I know, it's incarnational. The Word become flesh, not just the Word in 22 syllables. I don't get that, but I do. Because it's about power, it's about politics, and it's about a fear of relationships, and it's about a fear of embodiment, and there's a lot of fear to be dealt with. So I take solace in that simple phrase in Scripture, be not afraid. As I've written, that used to indict me because I've always been a fearful person. My dad used to look at me, and he was just mirroring back. He was a wonderful father. He just mirrored back and said, "You're running scared again, aren't you, partner?" He just wanted me to look at that. He wasn't beating me up about it. But I finally understood one day that phrase didn't say that I couldn't have my fears, which I will always have. It just said I didn't need to be my fears. To me, that was revelation. And I started thinking, well, of course I don't need to be my fears, because I got other stuff going on. Besides these fears I have, I also have hopes, I also have fellow feelings, I also have aspirations, I also have trust. I can make some choices about where to stand in my inner landscape as I approach you, or as I write a book, or as I deal with a difficult conversation. I can have fear without needing to be my fear. And so, I don't even remember your question. That's my best answer.
Well, thank you. And I know that I have probably about 3 hours worth of more questions that I'd like to ask you. But I also know that we have a really intelligent and caring group of people here who also would like to ask.
Very patient as well.
And so, I want to thank you, and I also want to turn things over. And I think we have a microphone here somewhere. Can I bring it? Okay. Question over here.
I just want to. I want to start by saying thank you so much for your work, department. It's been probably 22 years. It's been the required text in my intro to educational ministry course, and it transforms lives. The question I have is, I'm in a context where our board of directors is very corporate. Many of them come out of business models. Our administration, some of them have this business model idea. And their language for education is we have to have a delivery system for our education. I'm sure you must have heard that in your work, and I'm curious what kind of responses. It just drives me bonkers, and I'm looking for some good ways to talk about that, to try to have something to come back that's, less than 3 hours.
What do they mean by delivery system?
They mean something that will help us make money by pouring information into people's heads.
So, if I could have a conversation with them, I think I would start by asking the question, what do you mean by a delivery system? If that were the answer I got, I think the next question would be, what evidence do you have that pouring information into people's heads works in your world of business, let alone in education? I think that would be an interesting conversation because as far as I know, there's very little evidence that pouring information into people's heads works in the world of business. Every time I do a conference in a big hotel, there seems to be a staff development event for some major corporation going on. I was in a hotel the other day where one was going on for Boeing, and those people were doing sand tray play, and they were doing twister, and they were doing trust exercises. I thought I was back in Berkeley in the 60s. I don't know if they were doing any of the other stuff. There's a lot of cultural lags in our society. People trying to catch up, But, they were doing all this experiential stuff. There wasn't anybody standing up there lecturing and dumping information into their heads. Because, and I asked, there was a Boeing in-house trainer there as well as an external trainer. And I asked both of these people, what's this all about? And they said, well, we get people who have basic science information and math information, but they don't know diddly squat about how to work with others on solving complex problems, thinking on their feet, dealing with answers that with questions that aren't in the book and answers that aren't at the back of the book. So there's a gulf to be overcome here between the so-called business types who run our institutions, who know one thing in their own world, and then come over to our educational institutions and act as if they didn't know that. How does that happen? We need to hold that conversation and build that bridge, because there are more connections between those worlds in terms of pedagogy than anybody's letting on. But I think, I think that it's incumbent upon those of us in education to learn something about the world from which that power comes, so that we can ask the questions and give the examples. You read the best-selling authors in the business world, the best-selling pedagogical and educational authors, people like Peter Senge or Peter Block, Jim Kouzes. These people sell multi-millions of books and bring in hundreds of thousands to workshops, and not a lick of it is about information building, because it doesn't work in business. What? It's a shell game. and somebody has to say, the emperor has no clothes. Somebody has to say that, and has to say it loud and clear. We're caught. It seems to me we live in a society of massive confusion these days. So my favorite all-time book title is by a little-known Spanish pacifist named Lanza del Vasto, who was a disciple of Gandhi. And after 70 years of traveling on behalf of nonviolent social change through Europe, he was a kind of sojourner truth guy who walked a lot and witnessed. He wrote this little tiny book whose title I just adore. So, Principles and Precepts of the Return to the Obvious. and some of us have to be about that word and holding these conversations that help everybody come back to ground. Everybody needs to come back to ground. Yeah, everybody needs to calm down, like time out. Let's use our indoor voices. Keep it simple, keep it sane, and let's talk about what really works in your world as well as mine.
Hello, Parker. Over here.
Oh, there you are.
Yes.
I thought it was God. This may be the big moment. My answer 10
Parker, you said that we can have fears, but we have to try not to be our fears. I was wondering if you could clarify what you mean by being our fear, by perhaps giving an example of that.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So what I'm aware of is that I have what I call in the subtitle of The Courage to Teach, I have an inner landscape, exploring the inner landscape of a teacher's life. And it has lots of locations. And one of those places is called fear. But then there are places called hope and trust, fellowship, faith, and so forth. And an inner journey to me is in part about learning that landscape well enough that I can make fairly conscious, intentional decisions about where to stand in that landscape as I move toward you or approach a job or a moment or an experience. To be reflective about that, to step back, to pause, to breathe, to not get engaged in that frenzied cycle of activist knee-jerk response that always has me coming from my sort of default place, which is a place of fear. So I don't think I've ever gotten up in front of an audience without feeling fear. I don't think I've ever stood up in front of a class without feeling fear. I don't think I've ever sat down in front of a blank page with a high aspiration about what I wanted to write without feeling fear. The first thing I need to do is to know that that's where I am at that moment, and not just take it for granted, or that's just the way it is. The second thing I need to do is to step back and say, where else might I stand? And the third thing I need to do is to know something about how to move to that alternative place and approach that audience or that class or that blank page from a place of hope or trust. So for me, an audience is, I need to remind myself that they want this to work as much as I do, or they wouldn't be here. If I stand in a place of fear, I could say to myself, they're here to find out what's wrong with what I'm saying, to inform me, right? And maybe some of that will happen, and that will be fine if I can be in this other place of saying, we want to make this work together. That's why we're all here. So I'll give them my best to help that happen. I'll bet that will evoke in most of them the same response. And if in the course of that we find some stuff that needs to be clarified or corrected or sorted out where I was flat wrong, then it'll be net meaning. I'll get it right, and I'll be able to thank them for it. It's just interesting to be in a place where you trust enough that you're really able to say thank you to your critics when they help you get something righter than you had it before. And you know you wouldn't have gotten there without them. So I think that's the kind of thing I do. Yeah, Tom Green.
I think I can get by without the microphone. Parker, thank you. This has been one of the most inspiring sessions of Mapbury REA that I've been to. I've been to 35 years of Mapbury. So thank you. The question I wanted to, of course, I love what you say about listening to people, hearing their stories. and then maybe we know how to share the greater story. I've come across that before. But the question I want to ask is a somewhat personal one, but then you've been so open and personal with us that I'm taking the risk of asking it, but if it's invasive, then just let it pass. And that is, what sustains you? What are the spiritual practices that keep you on? Because I share so many of your passions and commitments and aspirations, and yet there are days I find it very difficult in my church, and I suppose in all of our churches, to keep on. And so there's something that you have, or practices, I imagine, that enable you to do it again, day after day, and to keep on, and keep the hope alive. Could you share some of them with us?
Well, thank you. Yeah. You know, Tom, that's a wonderful question. I really appreciate it very much, because for me, that's stuff that I don't mind at all talking about before other people, because I find it therapeutic for me, in the sense of, if I can tell my own truth to others, it holds a mirror up to me where I can keep looking at whether I've got it right. And I always feel like that if I can reach deeper into my own experience, if there's only one person out there who finds that helpful, then it's been a good day, when that resonates. So for me, as I've written that some people are contemplatives by intention. I'm a contemplative by catastrophe. I've never had a highly intentional spiritual discipline. I do not have, at least what anybody would recognize as a classical spiritual discipline. I do not have a set-aside time every day to meditate and contemplate and pray. I do not have a particular routine that I go through. Unless you count writing itself as a spiritual discipline, in which case I get up at 5 every morning, I go to the keyboard, and I write until about noon. And somewhere around 2 o'clock, my wife says, "Would you mind shaving, showering, getting out of your bathroom and pajamas and looking like a grown-up?" I find writing to be the way I explore what's going on inside of me, and to be an ongoing therapy. So that's a part. It's truth-telling and mirror-holding to myself, and a lot of it finds its way into print. Not all of it, but a lot of it. There's also, as you well know, another stage in writing, which is the crafting of what has just flowed out. And for me, that takes 10, 12, 14 drafts. And I enjoy the craftsmanship, fortunately, as much as I do the flow. And I often discover more of my own truth in the crafting. I find myself digging deeper still. Another thing I do on a regular basis is walk in the woods. I let all the thinking go, pretty much. It's amazing how often I'll come back from a 2-hour walk in the woods with a solution to a problem that I wasn't even thinking about, consciously, in the writing. I have a few close and trusted friends, including my wife, with whom I can be very transparent, and who are truth tellers for me. Who will tell me if they think I'm dissembling, debating, cutting the corners on something. And I have a wonderful therapist that I talk to every 2 weeks who's a lot simpler than I am, which is exactly what I need. I'm a very complicated person. He's not. And it's a terrific partnership. So he asked me these simple questions that I failed to ask myself. I'm grateful for his friendship on the journey. I spend a lot of time in solitude and silence, either in these activities, or some of these activities that I've been in, or just sitting under a tree, or out on our back porch staring. And one thing that I appreciate from my ongoing experience of Quaker meeting is the capacity to quiet down pretty quickly and to go to this place inside myself where there's, which is sort of beyond words. I seem to know the path there. I can't tell you how I learned that, but for 11 years I lived in a Quaker community, intentional community called Emerald Hill, where we had every morning this hour-long silent meeting for worship. And I think that gave the formation, reprogramming, and gave me that showed me the path to that place. I've never lost it.
Well, I see that we're out of time here, so I think I'll be able to, I see we're out of time, and I wanted to be able to thank Parker for this wonderful conversation, and thank you all for the questions that you raised. I think this is a very nice point to end on, because we've been able to kind of explore the big picture and come right back to the issue of the soul, and how we all need to tend to ourselves, and as a way of tending to the bigger endeavors that we're all engaged in. And so I just want to thank you so much for helping us all to remember that we don't need to be perfect, or we don't need to be the ideal educators or somebody else's motive, but that we need to be humans, and we need to figure out how to be ourselves. And that's a big part of what this calling to be part of the common good is about.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor to be with you. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Thank you so much.